One of the most powerful tools that we have in cybersecurity is language, words. Language shapes technology. It allows us to be here, to exchange ideas, to debate them. It's why Enigma exists. Analogies and metaphors have been used in cybersecurity for ages. They outdate the internet, and when you start paying attention, you notice how complex they are, how much they're used in our everyday language. And for many of us in cybersecurity, we feel like firefighters. Using analogies can help people understand our message and explain really detailed technical concepts. But simplistic explanations can also lead to misconceptions. In 1984, 1 year after the internet was born, Fred Cohen wrote a program that spread by attaching itself to other software, and he called that a computer virus. 1 year. In fact, some analogies that we use in computing and in cybersecurity predate the internet. The OSI model, for example, has been used since the 70s, and I still learned about it going to school to study computer science. But that explosion of words has come with the internet. The information superhighway, the web, cyberspace. You can probably think of many, many more. And before we get to the modern day, let's pause at one moment in history. In 2006, Senator Ted Stevens, you might recall, made an infamous line.
The internet is not something that you just dump something on. It's not a big truck. It's a series of tubes.
It's a series of tubes. I think a lot of us, like now, still chuckle a little bit at that saying, and it has persisted throughout history. Ted Stevens had an important role on the Senate Committee for Commerce, Science, and Transportation, which had authority over many parts of the internet. And they were debating important things about net neutrality. The question is, was that analogy helpful or harmful? I'm going to argue with you that Ted Stevens was talking to his Senate colleagues, and it wasn't as bad for them as it might feel to us even today. But our words do matter. And Ted Stevens' words could have impacted even laws and norms and other things that had real-world impact. And the goal that I want to talk through today is that our audiences can be helped or harmed based on our cybersecurity analogies. I'd also like to pause just for a second and thank Gene Spafford at Purdue and Lee Metcalf at Carnegie Mellon. The three of us have been thinking about these topics for a little while. So why are there so many analogies? Why do we use these so often? As I said, our language is rich with this, from keys to Trojan horses to firewalls, and we look for the needle in the haystack, right? We evict malware that's resident on our systems. We debate baked in versus bolted on security. There's no end to this language. But of course, we don't mean any of those things literally. That's never been the point. So let's consider 3 reasons why maybe they have persisted in the language. First is analogies can help us learn. It can help teach. They were used with me when I was in school because it allowed my instructors to introduce a concept that we would get into details later. So a lock and a key shares some similarities with encryption, but of course, I went on to read books about encryption and to learn the details of how those things were both similar to the physical world and also different. Number 2, they can help us connect our mental models for how things work, just like a Trojan horse. If an alert pops up for an average user and the description from the antivirus company says that this is a Trojan horse, I think the average person very intuitively and quickly understands that that's important. They have some general sense, even though they probably don't remember history class and they probably don't know exactly what the computer program is, but they understand the kind of danger that they're faced with. And that helps them make better decisions. And so in that sense, that's another reason I think we see analogies. The third is that it can explain rather complex topics in a very teachable, easy to explain kind of way. And if you ask the average person on the street, what is a firewall? See if we can take a survey out on the street. I think people would generally tell you that this is a kind of technology that blocks bad things from getting through onto my network. They're not wrong, right? They have a general sense for that. In fact, they might understand a computer firewall more than they understand that the firewall has been around for 100 years. The firewall has been around in cars, in buildings, long before it existed in technology. And yet, people do understand the general sense for that. So given these advantages, what causes people to fail? I want to talk about three. First, I think analogies omit and overgeneralize important details that matter in the conversations that we're having. We have limited attention spans, all humans, and especially in headlines and media where we need to quickly capture people's attention, the analogy can be the way to do that. Those short, snappy headlines just draw more clicks, and not everybody knows enough to pick different words in those kinds of situations. So when we explain email like a postcard going through the mail, that is a pretty simplistic generalization. It might help people understand privacy, but there are a lot of nuances to that example that in some conversations require more detail. Number two, analogies can mislead, sometimes even deliberately, because they connect to some experience that's out of proportion. And I think that's dangerous. An example here are cyber weapons. No cyber weapon has caused the same physical destruction as a kinetic weapon. And worse, we start to use analogies like Cyber 9/11 or Cyber Pearl Harbor, which are not well connected to the physical world things and do a disservice to that conversation. Number three, analogies in the worst case can have a normative dimension. And we saw that a little bit with Senator Stevens. They can help the imaginary become reality. If we start writing laws about the series of tubes, that might lead to a very poor outcome. And thankfully, I couldn't find very many concrete examples of this, but I do worry about the possibility of it. So I'd like to present 4 ways that we use analogies, 4 kinds. And I'm going to start with the physical world, because there's a lot of analogies to the physical world, including, of course, the weakest link. Cybersecurity bears a lot in common with a chain, no doubt about it. There are many components that matter. There are many people that matter. The users are one, developers, system administrators, the code that we use. All of those things do help ensure that the system provides the security that we intend to. And in that sense, that's a pro for that analogy. It is a way to describe that. The trouble is when we say that the user, for instance, is the weakest link. I think that does a disservice and a dishonest conversation to a really important part of cybersecurity, which is users are targeted all the time. And they are like the ones that the blowtorch is just firing on that link in the chain. And so we need more defense for them. And to call them the weakest link as an analogy doesn't get to that nuance. What about cybersecurity and medical, biologic analogies? Again, in the pro, the benefit of this analogy is that it's a term commonly understood. Things like viruses. The average people, especially now, understand health. They understand contamination. They understand spread. And in that sense, they're right. Computer viruses do similar things like that. The trouble is that digital defenses don't behave like biological defenses. For all the advances in antivirus and host-based protection, they don't learn the way that a biological system does. And if somebody believes that the computer will just learn through exposure how to protect against a digital threat, they will be worse off. Depends on the conversation that we're having with the people. Let's talk about cybersecurity and military analogies. These are ones that I see more and more. Let me use the example of a blast radius. That is a term, a phrase that I see used especially in the media to describe not how energy from a bomb sort of propagates, that's what the physical world blast radius is, but in terms of things like credential theft. Oh, your password is compromised. What's the blast radius of that impact? In some sense, it does give a sense of scope to the person about the damage, which is, it isn't just one system, if you reused your password that might have damage, it might also affect other systems. That's true. There are secondary effects. but they are not certainly confined to physical space. And people who think about the blast radius of a bomb might think the same, that broken mental model, about how it works on the internet, that there's a physical dimension to it. I'll give you a bonus one here too, since I used the picture of a castle. When I was studying cybersecurity in school, it was very often taught to us that cyber was like defending a castle. There was a fixed boundary. There were valuables inside the castle, and that we needed to protect those things. But of course, modern networks are nothing like a castle. Users move, the things of value are not physically in one place. There's no hard perimeter to defend in the way that we used to. And so I don't talk about it in terms of castle defense anymore. It's not a good analogy. And let's talk about a fourth, which are legal analogies in cybersecurity. In fact, the law has a long history of using legal analogies. They compare, for example, digital files to paper files and filing cabinets to digital storage systems. That means that the law doesn't have to change for every new technology. That can be helpful. Trespassing is another way where we can use existing laws and apply them in the digital realm. And in that sense, they share a lot in common. It's about accessing some system without authorization. That can happen whether it's in my home or on my laptop. But of course, the downside here is that courts have struggled to distinguish when the digital world is different than the physical world. And in the case of trespassing, what constitutes access? Is browsing the internet or browsing a website access? What if I want to revoke my access? It becomes very difficult in the details in terms of somebody walking into my house with a key or my authorization and accessing my computer. The nuance, the details matter here quite a bit. And the law struggles with this, just as we ought to be careful in cybersecurity. So there are pros and there are cons. And the time when we should be using analogies in cyber is, in the best case, when they are truthful and they are helpful in that instance, very contextual. But of course, the negatives are also pitfalls, and we have to be careful that we don't pick analogies that are inaccurate, incomplete, or just the wrong type of conversation for the context that you might be in. And sometimes the negatives will outweigh the positives, and you must decide very carefully in a particular given conversation, is this the correct and the best way to communicate? Let me give you one that I like. I like the analogy of hygiene. Like the virus, like things that people understand, having basic behavior that everybody teaches their children, like brushing their teeth, washing their hands. I think the concept of cyber hygiene can be effective in cybersecurity. If we teach people to always check their links, to always understand the impact of their passwords, it can become basic routine that does help keep people safe. And so that is one that I like. So that said, how can we avoid the misconceptions? I want to give you three things to think about. First is to recognize the audience that you are speaking with when you decide that an analogy might be appropriate. This is about being context aware. And a simple imperfect analogy might be fine. It might be appropriate. If you're having a casual conversation with friends where the stakes are very low, knock yourself out. But the more that we use analogies, even in those situations, the more normative they become. The more people hear it, even in casual conversation, the more it is likely to stick. So even when the stakes are low, we ought to be a little bit careful. Number two, we should try to refine the message. Don't forget the other tools in the language toolbox. Try using a story, a personal experience when you need to help an audience understand some topic where you might otherwise feel drawn to an analogy. I think about blast radius and the invasion of Ukraine. The Russians attacked satellite modems of tens of thousands of people with the byproduct that people they weren't trying to target in Europe also had their internet cut out. That is essentially what a blast radius is meant to describe, but people might understand the story better by just explaining with a modern story. Third, we have to respect our roles. We have a lot of influence. Policymakers have influence. Expertise is very powerful, and we have to be careful about that when using analogies. We don't want to unintentionally reinforce some some message that we don't really want to propagate or to persist. And that is including things like Cyber 9/11 or Cyber Pearl Harbor. Our words will matter a lot in those conversations, and they will be remembered. I also don't want analogies to unreasonably restrict our policy options unnecessarily. So when we're talking about complex cybersecurity or setting policies, we have to see the world as it is. It's complex, it's complicated, it's unpredictable. And the alternative is this incorrect or misleading mental model. I think this is where the danger can become reality. So in closing, we can all be effective communicators. We can deliver the cybersecurity results that we want to when we're careful and deliberate about our language, just as we need to be careful not to slide down the slippery slope. Thank you very much.